Opinions about policy, and what do you do with those ideas about policies? How does that come into your journalism?
I mean, I don't actually feel all that comfortable in general talking about policy. I mean, I have no aspiration whatsoever to be a policy maker, and anytime unless people really know what they're talking about when they try to sort of say what they think the policy should be, it always kind of sounds a little bit like bullshit. But but having said that, I mean, I think the role of journalists is not necessarily to come up with what they, people always say, well, if you don't like that, what's your alternative? It's not about not liking it. It's about providing an alternative perspective to that which is being advocated by the Democrats or the Republicans on any given day, and trying to fill in parts of the picture that are left, unpainted or unstated. But I, as an American, and a voter, someone who lives in this country and feels responsible, as I think all of us should collectively, for the policies enacted by our government. I mean, I'm informed by my experiences on the ground. I mean, I don't say lightly that I think our policy is resulting in creating more new enemies than it is killing actual terrorists. And I'm not saying it from my position in the 83rd Chairborne Division. I'm actually going into the field and doing research and talking to people. So and I also 10 years ago, I think I thought I understood the world better than I do now, and because I think all of us at some point in life take a humility pill about what you do and don't know, and when you can and can't prove. I definitely believe that we've hit a point with the drone strike, with the drone program, where we should have a moratorium on drone strikes. I think they are a net loss for the United States, regardless of what you think of the broader, what do we call it now, the global contingency operation, former war on terror. Regardless of what you think about it. The drones are having a tremendous propaganda value for some of these resistance groups, but also we don't actually know who we're killing in many of the strikes that are being conducted right now, particularly in Yemen and in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, it's a little bit different because there's more of a ground infrastructure where the U.S. has operatives on the ground that can follow up on strikes and make sure that the person that they were trying to kill is indeed the person that they killed. But in some of these other countries, it's almost impossible to confirm. So, to the extent which I've been asked to testify in front of Congress, I don't answer the question of what I think should be done, because I don't believe I have the answer to that. What I'm trying to do is provide a perspective that will enhance the debate in this country, and that's ultimately what I think is a major part of the role of particularly investigative journalism. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. I've heard you speak on Democracy Now! About the changes in name of Blackwater, the evolution of the interests of our friends and so on. But I'm wondering, what is the ongoing role of Blackwater-like institutions, companies and stuff in Afghanistan? I mean, we know the name Blackwater, it's very common now, but we don't know a lot of other names. What are those people doing in Syria and whatever?
Well, I mean, Blackwater sort of became like Kleenex. Kleenex is actually just facial tissue, but Kleenex is a brand, and Blackwater sort of became this term that ended up being used to describe a lot of the private security contractors or private military contractors. There were, at one point, I think there were 649 companies that were providing security or security type services in Iraq and Afghanistan, for the U.S. I mean, it's a growing industry. Blackwater, it changed its name, I think, 4 or 5 times. Now it's called Academy, with an I, it's French. I like to laugh at my own jokes, apparently. Obama, it was interesting, when Obama was running for president, I did this story where I was trying to get a sense of, Obama and Hillary Clinton, what was their position on the use of these companies. And Obama's people, it was Dennis McDonough at the time, this was in the 08 campaign. Now Dennis McDonough, of course, is the head honcho running things at the White House. But I emailed Dennis and said, I'm doing this piece, and I had actually worked with Obama's Senate office and I was trying to encourage them to change some of the text in a bill that Obama was submitting about private military contractors, because that had a sort of gaping loophole in it. And so I worked with them a little bit. I don't know Obama personally. I just worked with his office a little bit on something. So I said, I'm going to do this piece, and I want to clarify what Senator Obama's position is going to be on Blackwater. And he basically said, you know, that he's going to regulate them and make their activities lawful. When I called Hillary Clinton's people and told them that that's what Obama's response was, Hillary Clinton puts out the statement saying she's going to ban Blackwater. Like explicitly says that they will be banned under my administration. Irony of ironies is that then Hillary Clinton becomes Secretary of State and is then the boss of Blackwater and is running all the mercenary companies when she was Secretary of State. And so Obama kept them on the payroll in Afghanistan, working for the big DOD, for the Joint Special Operations Command and Special Operations Command for the Special Ops Forces, for the CIA, and for the State Department. When congressional delegations would go to Afghanistan, they would be protected by Blackwater generally. I mean, now I think another company has a contract, but for a good part of, particularly the first term of Obama, Blackwater remained a very prime contractor. In fact, they were engaged in such sensitive operations, even continuing under Obama, that when forward operating base Chapman was bombed in Khost, Afghanistan, in December of '09, when this triple agent Balawi, this Jordanian guy, went there and got onto the base and was able to blow himself up. If you saw Zero Dark 30, they have a fictionalized version of that series of events. But two of the people who were killed that day were Blackwater guys, and they were guarding I think she was the deputy chief of station in Afghanistan. That industry has grown exponentially since 9/11. It wasn't created as a result of 9/11. It had already been in full swing. I mean, if you go back and read Eisenhower's farewell address, you know, Eisenhower sort of saw this coming, but he wasn't envisioning a world where the actual fighting of the wars was being outsourced to soldiers. His concern was about weapons manufacturers becoming deeply involved with the political process in the United States.
Who could hire Blackwater, quote unquote, can Assad hire a company like Blackwater?
I mean, anyone.
Protect her?
Well, I mean, this is going to get into a very technical discussion. If an American company wants to provide services to a foreign government, they have to get a license from the Treasury Department, from the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. They have to be approved to provide services to that foreign government. What's more likely is that you'll have you know, some Americans or Brits or maybe South Africans who were involved with training Iraqi special forces, and they set up their own shop and register it in Dubai, and they then rent out their U.S.-trained Iraqi special forces veterans to a regime. That was going on all the time in Libya. I mean, I've heard there's a scuttlebutt about activities of private military companies in Syria. I haven't seen anything that's definitive proof, and I don't like speculating about that, but if a U.S. company wanted to provide those services, they would need to get a license from the Treasury Department or the State Department.
But there are many other ways.
Well, there are other ways. That's why a lot of these companies have positioned themselves in Dubai. I mean, if you go to Dubai, it's like mercenary palooza. You know, it's like it's full of these PMCs. Yeah, go ahead.
First off, I just want to thank you for coming to speak to us. Probably like everyone else, I admire both your courage to send 1 million letters to your favorite journalist and your courage to risk your life for journalism. But,
thank you.
My question is, did you find the media's portrayal of Iraq different from your own experience, and if so, how?
I mean, the short answer is yes, but not necessarily for like some nefarious reason. I mean, I think, you know, I don't know if there are veterans in the room, but I'd also be curious in hearing their answer to this question if you were in Iraq or Afghanistan. But this may sound like a ridiculous statement that I'm going to make. If someone disagrees with it, I'd be happy to hear it. But war is boring until it's not, and that's part of what's so frightening about it. You know, a lot of what you're doing is waiting for something to happen. You're driving around not knowing whether an IED is going to go off on the side of the road, or your car's going to break down and snipers are going to come and get you. But a lot of what you're doing is killing time pursuing stories. As a journalist, not as a soldier, but as a journalist, you know, you're trying to figure out a way to safely meet this person that you're going to meet. And so, you know, there's this sort of mundane nature to being in many conflict zones or war zones. And then all of a sudden, it's the most terrifying form of non-boredom that you could imagine, where someone is shooting and you're in a mud trench, and there's mortar fire coming in, and you don't know how you're even going to get out. I was in that situation once when I was in Serbia with these paramilitaries, where we were being shelled, and we're like, you know, waist deep in this muddy trench, and we had no clue how we were going to leave, and no clue if the people that were shooting at us from the higher ground were going to come down and kill us. You know, and eventually we were able to get out, but. I think that there was an over-reliance in Iraq on embedded journalism, And I think a lot of what was being reported was a very narrow section of the war. And I think that, with a handful of exceptions, including some people that work for powerful corporate media outlets who did fantastic reporting, there was very little reality that was put into the homes of Americans about what this meant on a civilian or human level to people in Iraq. And I think that really does a disservice to the debate. There's discussion about how many Iraqis were killed, and I don't think we'll ever actually know. But we live in a society where we have shows called The Real Housewives of, Beverly Hills, and we have no coverage of the real widows of Baghdad. And I think that if Americans were forced to know Iraqis or Afghans or Yemenis or Somalis as people, it would be more difficult to sort of flippantly just say, oh, I support this or I'm against it. You would have to actually think about it. So I think the epic failure of the coverage of that war was a failure to humanize the Iraqi people in general. Yeah. Go ahead.
What do you think of the reporting on the current situation in Syria and for the past year?
Yeah, the reporting on the current situation in Syria. I think the McClatchy News Service has emerged really as one of the best media outlets in the U.S. I mean, they had done some fantastic reporting earlier on in the Iraq War, but their coverage of Syria has been really critical and fantastic and human. In fact, a guy named Austin Tice, who is a combat Marine veteran turned journalist, I had emailed with him actually when he was in law school at Georgetown, has been missing in Syria for a year. And it's really scary because he's a former Marine, but he is a legitimate journalist. He definitely was not there as a spy. We believe he was taken by Assad's people, and he's been missing for a year. And the concern is because of his military background that they may have already killed him or may kill him. There are I think 7 or 8 journalists right now that are missing in Syria. I think there are many news outlets that have done a tremendous job covering the human terror that exists there as a result of the civil war. I have serious concerns about the U.S. intervening. I don't think that there has been enough critical reporting on who the various factions are. John McCain, I think, and Lindsey Graham have they use this term, the vetted opposition. And I think partly because there's not that many people on the ground reporting, it's difficult to get a clear sense of the nuances of who the various groups are. But I tend to think that the journalists that are on the ground, almost all of them seem to be doing their best to just tell people what they're seeing, and they're doing it at great risk. And I'm sitting here with you guys at Yale in the Master's House. I'm not going to start criticizing people who are in a dangerous war zone in that way. But the final point that I'll make on that is that I think that there was an interesting piece in the Washington Post. I was talking with students about this earlier today, last week, where Barton Gellman reported on this one of the Snowden documents, which was called the Black Budget. It was the congressional budget for the intelligence community, and I was able to read that entire document when I was in Rio, and some parts of it I can't really talk about, but the parts that were published in the Post. Gellman, in like the 5th to last paragraph of a very long story, mentions that the U.S. had sensors inside of Syria. And this is a document that was written at least a year ago or so, that could detect chemical weapons use. And if anybody who's been following this knows something different than what I'm about to say, just correct me. But my understanding of the case that Secretary of State Kerry has made, that the President made, is that they are relying on other nations' intelligence services when they're asserting that they have definitive proof that the chemical weapons were used. Now, I think it's perfectly plausible that Assad did order the use of chemical weapons. I think it's plausible that one of his people in a rogue act did it. I think it's possible that someone allied with the rebels did it. None of those would shock me. And I tend to stay out of that debate because I don't actually know. But what I do know is that there is an assertion in this classified budget that says that the U.S. had sensors there. So if that was true, why wouldn't the U.S. say we have definitive proof? Not from our allies, which quite likely is probably Saudi Arabia and Israel, but we have this proof. Maybe they'll say because it's sources and methods, because we have the sensors in there and we don't want to say it. I don't know, but I think that there are a lot of questions that need to be asked in the context of this. They were so eager, it seemed, to take military action. And then Obama does this thing, which I still, for the life of me, can't intellectually figure it out. Presidents never should go to Congress unless there's one of two reasons for doing it. You know you're going to win, or you know you're going to lose, and the point is to make Congress look bad for obstructing something that you think the American people are supporting. It really does seem that they went there not knowing that they were going to lose. And I don't get the logic of that. It was like, and then sending Kerry, who was just flip-flopping, and I know he's a Yalie, but he was just flip-flopping his way through his Senate testimony. Then he tells the House something completely different. Then they have to send Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State, out at the White House to kind of make it seem like the adults are back in charge. I mean, the whole thing is just on a conventional political level has just been utterly mismanaged. And it's a misreading of the times in which we live. I mean, Rand Paul is no longer viewed as just a fringe character. There is a growing chorus of sort of libertarian voices that are not just the Tea Party. And they've allied with a lot of progressives on Capitol Hill. And there's this interesting sort of alliance that's formed. And I think the White House sort of underestimated how serious the sentiment is against the direction that his foreign policy is going in on these issues. Yeah, go ahead.
You were over in Iraq with Kathy Kelly during the time of sanctions. I hope you could talk more about that. I interviewed a UN official in '96 who talked about 500,000 children dying from the sanctions that our governments put in. And Dennis Halliday, when he quit the UN, said maybe 1 million Iraqis had died from the sanctions. And that's all erased from US history books. Could you talk about the sanctions?
Well, I mean, what happened after I view the U.S. as having been at war in Iraq in one form or another since the early 1980s. When Donald Rumsfeld went to meet with Saddam Hussein and gave him a pair of golden cowboy spurs, which I saw in the Saddam Museum in Baghdad, as a gift from President Reagan. They had lifted Saddam's regime off of the list of state sponsors of terrorism and then sold helicopters and chemical weapons to Saddam's forces, and that which were then used in Halabja and elsewhere. And I think U.S. policy has been consistent in the sense that it's been sort of consistently anti-Iraqi civilians in a lot of ways. The sanctions on Iraq were really unprecedented. It was almost like a starvation blockade. And to be in those hospitals in Iraq during the sanctions period was like going, Kathy would talk about this all the time, like visiting a death row for infants. You'd have doctors saying to you, the only difference between me and my patients is that I have a white jacket on and I know how I can treat them, but I don't have the supplies to treat them. And you would see this in place after place. And it really, I was a really young, sort of green reporter at the time when I was doing that, and I didn't understand much about the political context of why the sanctions were in place in Iraq, but I certainly saw just these horrors that are forever fossilized in my head. And I think that it's quite possible that the death toll that resulted from the sanctions, which overwhelmingly targeted civilians, not Saddam's regime. If anything, it helped Saddam's government maintain power because people were so preoccupied with just trying to figure out how to survive that they didn't have time to organize anything resembling like an Arab Spring against Saddam Hussein. But I think that the numbers killed in the sanctions period, it's possible that they eclipse the numbers killed in the actual shock and awe and then invasion and occupation of Iraq. But it was, it's a chapter of history I think young people should read because it's war through other means other than using actual missiles or tanks or fighter jets. Yeah, let's go ahead.
You talked a little bit about, or mentioned sort of U.S. exceptionalism, and I'm thinking particularly given the comments that Vladimir Putin just released kind of about the Syria situation. And you definitely think we encourage people to have a more complex view of the conflicts aren't just good and bad, but do you think that a single nation would ever be justified in intervening elsewhere, sort of like either with the international community or if they're not able to do that, which is basically what happened now, he was thinking about it, but are they ever justified, you think, in intervening in another state's sovereignty?
Yeah, Samantha Power, who's the new U.S. ambassador to the UN, was on NPR the other day, and she was asked, about the legality of the operation, if they don't get UN approval, and she refused to sort of directly answer the legality question, just kept using the word legitimate, that it's legitimate. The U.S. certainly has asserted that. When the Kosovo War happened in '99, the U.S. failed to get UN approval, and so they used NATO as a sort of legitimizing vehicle to justify a 78-day air attack on another member state. Most nations in the world do not believe that a unilateral action by another state against another nation would be legitimate unless it was in self-defense and consistent with with international law and the rules governing various international conventions. But in real political terms, the United States refuses to recognize an international criminal court. When there was discussion of Clinton ratifying the ICC in the 90s, Republicans started to talk about introducing what they called the Hague Invasion Act that would have permitted U.S. military forces to enter The Hague to liberate any U.S. personnel taken on war crimes charges. And I mean, to me, that's one of the primary examples you can point to of just naked American exceptionalism, that international law is for certain types of countries or conflicts and people, but not for us, unless we have a veto authority over it. And I think that if China or Russia were to propose the kind of intervention in a sort of bizarro world that the U.S. is talking about in Syria, I think the U.S. would be very, very firmly opposed to it. So, but we live in a world where who would stop the United States from doing that? You know, there's no nation that would be able to effectively confront the U.S. And you know, because Russia and China have veto power at the UN, and Russia would almost certainly use its veto power if it came to it with Syria, I think the U.S. line on it is, okay, if we're going to have these obstructionists here, we have to develop a coalition of nations that are willing to do this, and they'll find Palau and whoever else they get on board, and then they'll go to war. And you know, so I don't know exactly what the sort of, you know, what answer you were exactly looking for, but my sense is that the vast majority of nations in the world don't like the idea of unilateral action. But in real political terms, it doesn't matter. The U.S. will do it if it wants to do it. Is that answering your question or not?
Yeah, no, it does. I guess I'm just thinking, like, I could definitely say that no one would stop the U.S., but I also don't see countries expecting anyone but the U.S. to do something like that.
I mean, that's pretty much what Afghanistan is now. I mean, it's down to, you know, there's a smattering of other countries, you know, of other countries that have people there, but, you know, a lot of countries are saying that we're done with this thing and we're hightailing it out of here. Yeah, go ahead.
My question was more about just like your writing and your journalism. People naturally have biases, and I know a lot of Americans who have an American bias, and you talk about reporting from the other end of the gun. How do you remain unbiased and not try to compensate for, you know, the innate, I guess, American bias that you may have had growing up, and not be overly humanizing the people that we are going against, if that is possible?
Yeah. Well, you always have to keep yourself in check. I mean, if you go to, I mean, I know that I'm against certain wars that I'm going to cover, so I'm already predisposed to be looking for ways to bolster the argument that I'm already making. And I mean, that's just a natural, I mean, to be completely honest, it's a natural human instinct. You know, if you on principle you're against something, you're looking for affirmation that what you believe is true. But, you know, I'll give you a sort of concrete example. In the current book that I wrote, Dirty Wars, and in the film that we made, one of the characters in it is this guy Anwar al-Awlaki, who is an American citizen who was an imam at a mosque in Virginia, and after 9/11 became a very prominent voice interviewed by big media outlets, and he had already become very popular among young English-speaking Muslims around the world, you know, because he spoke in a sort of with a pop culture references in his teachings about the Quran and about the Prophet Muhammad, and he would sort of create his own, he would riff on the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad and then put in them, you know, references to football matches, and you know, he would talk about, he often would quote Malcolm X, and so he was this sort of fiery guy that was very popular, and then he became a kind of media celebrity. And then as the U.S. wars started expanding post 9/11, you saw him his rhetoric started to get sharper and sharper and sharper, and he began, you know, openly advocating that people, you know, take up arms against, you know, the United States and other nations. And you know, the U.S. eventually hunted him down, tracked him down, and then killed him in a drone strike. 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son was killed in a drone strike, and he wasn't with his father. He had nothing to do with terrorism. Hadn't seen his father in years, and the White House still has not explained why that kid was killed. That would be a much longer discussion. But the point I'm making in response to what you're saying is that when I was writing about Anwar al-Awlaki, I basically embedded with his family for various periods of time. I spent Ramadan with them. I kept the fast with them. I got to know them very well. I gained their trust. They gave me access to all of the female members of the family, which is very unusual in the cultural context there, and let me talk to Anwar al-Awlaki's mother, to his sister. I was around all of the children. We were there during Eid. They let us go through their photo albums, videos, and I grew to really like that family a lot. You know, they are very good people, and you know, and the parents of Anwar al-Awlaki had a son who did something that put him on the map in a way that no parent, I think, would want to see their kid be put on the map of fame in the world. He was never charged with a crime, never indicted, you know, for anything terrorism related. He was sentenced to death by the president without a trial or even a charge. To me, the story isn't about Anwar al-Awlaki, it's about who we are as a nation. How do we treat the most difficult cases defines us. But what I'm getting at is that I got to know this family, and I really do like them, and I'm still in touch with them. I mean, I Skype with them, but I had to say to them when I was doing this, you know, when I write this book, there are going to be things in there about your son and about your family that you're not going to want to read, and that are probably going to make you angry. And I would rather tell you that to your face than have you read it and then call me one day yelling at me. And I said, my promise to you is not that I'm going to paint your son in a heroic light, but that I'm going to paint him in an accurate light. And we've had a dialogue since then about things that they disagree with, or that they wish were in the book, but they always say, we understand that you're a journalism and we think you did a professional job. So you always have to put your biases in check. I mean, I really do like that family a lot, but I also felt like I had an obligation to say tough things about them that I knew were going to be hard for them to read because it was what was true. And if I couldn't do that, then I shouldn't tell the story at all. Yeah, go ahead.